Hello, my name is Leo. My today's guest obtained Bachelor of Science in Chemistry in Special Chemistry with first-class honor at the University of London. He was member of Royal Society of Chemistry. He gained Doctor of Philosophy degree in Chemical Physics at the University of Kent. He developed green audit books, and many of them were printed and produced by his own printing press. In 2004, he joined the Policy Information Network for Child Health and Environment as leader of the Science Policy Group. The aim of organization was to advise the European Commission about influence of environmental contamination on child health. Since Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident, he worked on health effects of ionizing radiation. After many researches and studies, he developed second event theory, and after about 16 years, secondary photoelectron effect theory. Despite all researches, his theories are not well accepted in the world of scientists. He also researched contamination with depleted uranium during the Gulf War struggles in Iraq, and after uses of depleted uranium ammunition in Kosovo, also studied fallouts in nuclear sites in England, Wales, Scotland and Sweden, and did many other researches. One of the last publicly well-known researches and appearances is related to disaster in nuclear power plant Daiichi in Japanese prefecture Fukushima. Speaking freely and having no hair on his tongue, he became one of controversial scientists by representing his theory. My guest is Professor Christopher Busby. Hello, Professor Busby.
Hello.
Intro was only a few words about you. Would you be so kind and tell us something more you think it is important about you and your work?
Well, this is what I think, that since the 1950s, science has increasingly become fragmented and compartmentalized into different disciplines. And what I do is I try to reassemble the parts. So in order to do the work I've done, I've had to make myself an expert in many different areas. And I've written some of these down: epidemiology, meteorology, atmospheric physics, hydrology, dispersion modeling, radiation biology, cell biology, physiology, biochemistry, pharmacology, genetics, radiation physics, nuclear physics, dosimetry, statistics, electromagnetic field theory. Anyway, I won't go through all of it, but you get the picture. The thing is that when I do court cases as an expert, which I do quite a few, what happens is that they bring in an expert, but it's always an expert in one narrow field, you see. And the problem is with science is that many areas of science cannot be pulled apart in this way. I mean, science is very powerful in the way that it dismantles a set of empirical observations into little pieces, and then looks at each one separately and tries to figure out a theory of that, and then it tries to put the whole lot back together. And that works for some types of science, but it certainly doesn't work for things to do with living systems. The living systems are extremely complicated and complex. And so if there's anything that I do that's different and that has put me where I am now and why I'm arguing with everybody, it's largely because I can see the whole picture. And it's very difficult for somebody to do that. You know, I haven't really done a lot of university work in my life. I've kind of kept out of universities. I've been more involved in thinking about things myself. And as a result of that, I'm in a position which is really quite unique now, you know, really quite unique. The other thing is that my main current and my life interest, the main interest I have, which never comes across in any of the things that I do on the internet or even anywhere else, is life. My main interest, right from when I was first working for the pharmaceutical company, Burroughs Wellcome, has been what is life? How does it work at the molecular level? What's going on there? And I've made some developments there. So that's what I like to do. That's my kind of main interest. But unfortunately, I spend most of my time doing radiation, which is extremely boring and actually not very difficult. There we are.
I said in introduction controversial. Do you think if that is usual way of communication, bringing new theories and conflict of opinions normal in science?
Well, if I understand you correctly, the point about controversial is that you are saying something that people don't like to hear. And it's always been the case, not only in science, but also in politics and in philosophy, that generally, if you say something that people don't like to hear, or particularly scientists, in this case, in the area that you work in, don't like to hear because they think something else, even normally throughout history, it's been quite difficult. Things, if you come up with some new idea, or if you come up with a new interpretation of the facts, then you're bound to be controversial. Yes. And of course, in the past, nearly all great theories or great developments in science have started by being controversial. I mean, the atomic theory, for example. I mean, in the early part of the 19th century, 20th century, Berzelius refused to believe in the atomic theory, and I mean, Newton's ideas about the universe were still not believed 20 years after his death. So controversy is not necessarily a bad thing, and it's almost inevitable if you come out with something new, and particularly if it's something that has economic associations, if it's bad for business. So if you come out with something like autism is caused by injections with these immunization schemes, then of course you're controversial, and very often you lose your job, as indeed that guy did. I mean, luckily for me, I don't really have a job to lose, so I can afford to be controversial. Although I have been kicked out of several universities, I have to say.
Okay. What is your opinion about science today?
I think science today is largely dead. There are two things about science today. First of all, the really big scientific questions are not asked. So, I mean, one question that I'm interested in, of course, is what is life? And you'll get loads of textbooks with pretty pictures of cells and lots of little diagrams and arrows with names on them for the various parts of cells and so forth. And if you look at proteins, and you'll find that they've got all these protein structures, and you see these amazing sort of convoluted pictures in different colors that look like somebody's dropped some spaghetti on the floor. And then there's an arrow saying active site, and I have to say you could have fooled me. So I don't think anybody really has the faintest idea what's going on at the cellular, at the molecular level in terms of life. And I have to say also in terms of the universe, if we go to the other extreme, and we go and look out in the universe, we find that the current theories of cosmology are just do not answer the observations. I mean, they've lost all this dark matter stuff. They've lost about 95% of the universe. It seems to me that science has somehow become black boxed into a corner. So that's the first thing. Somebody needs to get out the black boxes and open them up again and look inside to see where they went wrong along the way. But the other thing has to do with the discipline of science and what it considers that it can study and not study. So it's a bit like that famous painting by William Blake of Newton sitting by the seashore with his dividers measuring a little patch of sand, and all around him is darkness. So I think basically, science is great if we're talking about, developing a slightly better laser. But if we're talking about the big pictures, I don't think science is doing very well. And one of the problems, of course, is the universities. Because, as I said, it's all been black boxed into textbooks. So everybody reads the textbooks and the students are taught from the textbooks. And by the time they get through the university to the other end, they think they know science because they read all the textbooks and they've answered all the right questions in the examination. And then they go on to do a PhD in some slowly minor subject, and they come out as doctor, whatever it is. And they say, I'm a scientist. Then they go and work for Monsanto. So I think science has to be rebuilt from the ground up by people like you, maybe, people who just are interested and don't, and don't get sucked into the system. I think that's the problem. If you get sucked into the system, you go into the universities and you do your degree. By the time you come out of it, I think you've had it. You have to think of another way to go at it.
Working objectively with question of public health is not always pleasant question, and may oppose to the economic and political interests. What do you think is the best way to handle situations like knowing new, maybe unpleasant information?
Well, I've always believed that the scientist is no different from anybody else when it comes to that. So if you find that if you happen to stumble over a situation where somebody is stealing money, or somebody has killed somebody, or people are being poisoned in some way, it's your duty to blow the whistle. It's your duty to go outside and tell the public that there's something wrong. And so the way you do that is you go directly to the press. You go directly to the newspapers. You write books, you write leaflets, you chain yourself up to things if you have to. And in fact, I've done that too. So, for instance, in the past there was a situation where there was a nuclear power station in Wales which was very dangerous. And so we just chained ourselves up to the gate and we made lots of leaflets and so forth, and we closed the power station so it couldn't continue to run. But of course, that's not the kind of thing a scientist is supposed to do. But nevertheless, I think it's very important that you do that. In fact, in a recent court case, just this last year in the Royal Courts of Justice in London, I was ruled out as an expert witness. They said, you cannot be an expert witness under English law because you are also an activist. So, you write articles for The Ecologist, you chain yourself up to things, you go out on the internet with videos, and therefore you can't be an unbiased expert. They think that makes you biased if you don't sort of just publish in the peer review literature. But of course, this is the other problem about black boxing, that if we go back to your earlier question, the peer review literature is the ultimate black box, because the people who are the reviewers for the journals are people who are old people who believe in what it was that they were taught, and they were taught by people who believe what they were taught, and so on. So if you write an article, you write a scientific paper and you send it to one of these journals, then what happens is that the referee just throws it out. He says, this is absolute nonsense. I don't believe that. And he said, this is, so it gets rejected. So it's really quite difficult to get ideas out. Unless you've got the internet, of course, you can do that. But then problem is there's so many loonies on the internet, that it's difficult to distinguish the people who are okay from the people who think that aliens have invaded us and that, you can levitate and float across the sea by saying magic words. So there is a bit of a problem at the internet. Nevertheless, it's a very good thing that the internet exists and we can do things like this.
What was your best experience in your science work?
Yes. Well, I read your question. That's an interesting question. I'll tell you what it was. It was really quite simple. I had an idea that I could measure the oxygen level, the oxygenation of hemoglobin, of blood. Blood is red, and that when it's oxygenated, it's red, and when it's deoxygenated, it's a sort of slightly bluey color, okay? So it seemed to me as a spectroscopist, because I was trained as a spectroscopist, that I could figure out a way of measuring the oxygen in blood. And so just like you, I taught myself electronics. And so I bought all the resistors and transistors and optoelectronic components and so forth, and I fiddled about and I made a circuit that would amplify signals. And I wired it up to a recorder, and I made this device which shone light into the skin. And I made it out of car body filler and LEDs, so then I connected it all up and I put it on the recorder and switched it on, and it worked. I could see the heartbeat going like this, yeah. But then the funny thing was that it was going up and down, and so I thought, wow, that must be my breathing. You see, because as you breathe, the oxygen goes down through the blood supply, and this detector was on my hand. And so it went up and down with my breathing, but it was out of phase. So if I breathe in and I breathe out, then the peak went up and down about 2 seconds, 3 seconds later on. But the interesting thing was that there was another peak, a little echo. So if I breathed in and out, I got a peak and then a little peak. And then I breathed out and I get a little peak and then a little peak. So the first thing was it worked. So that was fantastic. I'd thought this idea out in bed. I'd made all the electronic circuitry. I'd made the little thing with all the widgets inside it. I'd put it on my hand. I'd stuck it on the recorder, and blimey, it works, okay? So not only do you see the heartbeat, but you see the breathing. And the second peak I figured out was the pulmonary circulation, because when you breathe in oxygen, you oxygenate the blood in two ways. First of all, the blood that goes from the heart is oxygenated, but then another circuit goes around the lungs and gets oxygenated, so you get a little echo, because that's the oxygenation circuit that oxygenates the heart itself, you see. It's called the pulmonary circulation. So that was such an immediate and major and entertaining triumph that I capered about in glee for some time. I know it's not a very big deal, but to me it was quite exciting to have figured it all out, and then it works.
Yes. I'm very interested in science and wants to become a good scientist, and I know how much work waits for me to do before, and how hard it is to bring a new theory, defend it, and get it recognized in science world.
Yes. Well, it depends upon the theory, and depends upon what you're saying. I mean, if it's something that goes forward from what everybody believes already, and particularly if it's something that nobody can understand, it's quite easy to get it sorted out, and then everybody says you're a genius. Okay. So you can publish stuff that if you want to publish stuff that people that will make you famous, you have to publish stuff that adds on to some big question mark, but is almost impossible to understand. Okay. And so what happens then is that nobody's prepared to say that they don't understand it, because that would make them seem stupid, you see. So then you become a hero, and everybody says how clever you are. But the problem is that if you try to publish anything in two areas, the first area is anything to do with which has economic effects. So, for example, the stuff I do, if it were to be accepted that what I'm saying is correct, that internal radionuclides that bind to DNA are very much more dangerous, and they can't be assessed in the way that they are currently being assessed, and then people are dying, then the problem is that you're shutting down the nuclear industry, and you're shutting down the military use of depleted uranium, and you're shutting down the idea that you can win a nuclear war, and all sorts of things. And particularly, you're shutting down the uranium economy. And now the uranium economy is an enormously expensive economy, so it's bad for business. So people don't like what I'm doing. And if you're in that area, like that guy Pushtai, who was writing articles about how GM, genetically modified potatoes were causing problems with rats, making them sick, then again, you find it very hard to publish it, and then very often you lose your job too. I mean, at the moment, I've been collaborating at the Karolinska Institute with Ole Johansson. Ole Johansson is somebody who believes that mobile phone radiation is particularly carcinogenic, and electromagnetic fields are carcinogens also. And as soon as we decided we were going to collaborate on a project, he lost all his funding and his laboratory was closed. This was about 5 years ago. So it's not easy to get stuff published that goes against, first of all, what everybody believes. So you then have to get past the referees, and secondly, that might be bad for business. So but that's not to say you shouldn't try to publish that, but you just have to find another way of doing it. You have to do it by writing a book. That's usually the best way. So you write a little book, and nowadays that's easy to do that. Easy to do that. So with all of this electronic and digital stuff and internet and so forth, it's not hard to do.
Okay, and what do you think is the best way to become scientist today?
I think the best way is what you're doing. I think it's always been, really. My colleague Ernest Sternglass, who was one of the first people to investigate this business of internal radiation in Pittsburgh, he was. And he when he was a young man, before he went to university, he had a theory about protons, which I think is a bit weird myself. But anyway, this was his theory. and about it was a sort of proton universe theory. And he wanted to talk to Albert Einstein, who was like the big cheese at the time. So he went along to Einstein, and he wrote a letter and said, I want to tell you about my proton theory. So anyway, somehow, because it was difficult to do, he ended up at Princeton, and he spent a whole day with Einstein. And he told me about it. He said what Einstein said to him. He said, if you're really interested in science, what you must do is become a cobbler. You must take some job which just pays you money and is useful, and then you must do all your thinking in your spare time. Okay? You must not go to university, because what will happen then is that all of your clever ideas and all of your independent and new, fresh perception of the empirical data will be squashed by your teachers, and by your by all the work you have to do, and have to write exams, and having to read all this nonsense, or maybe not. Some of it's okay, some of it's not okay. So what you must do really is to become a scientist in your head, and not try to become a scientist in a white coat that's got lots of degrees. And that can come later. You can do that later on. Once you've figured it all out yourself, as you work as a cobbler, or in the supermarket. Well, actually, preferably somewhere where you've got a bit of time, because that's the other thing nowadays. Everybody has to work all the time. All the great scientists were gentlemen. What they did was they just sat about, and they wandered around, and they looked outside and said, oh my goodness, that's jolly interesting. The sky is blue. I wonder why that is. And all that shit. The point is that they could do it, but nowadays you can't do it. You've got to run off to work and sort of make plastic extrusion moldings for windows and stuff like that. So this is a bit difficult nowadays. I'm quite sorry for young people nowadays who don't have some kind of independent means of support, But you don't have to be rich. Nowadays you can get all this equipment. I can see all these bits and pieces you've got there, oscilloscopes and whatnot. You can buy crap like that on eBay now for next to nothing, because nobody knows how it works and they don't want it. So, and transistors and resistors. Nowadays you can get an operational amplifier for 50 pence. Which is like an enormously powerful operational amplifier, just a little thing like a spider with 6 legs, and off you go. You can amplify anything. You can amplify picoamps. So there's a lot of fun to be had.
My preferred sciences are natural sciences. I like math, learning about chemistry, working with experimental physics, and especially about subatomic particles and energy. So many things, and I don't know yet what will be my primary interest for 2 years when I'll apply for university. So could you give me a guideline in my life which would help me to decide which science I should choose to go for?
Right, okay. Well, I notice you haven't said anything about biology there.
I'm also interested.
I'll tell you what I think is this. It's a question of size, The further down you go, the more difficult it is to understand what's happening. And so when you get down to subatomic particle level, I think that you're in an area where it's just all about arm waving and mathematics, and probably is wrong, in my opinion. There's probably a lot of nonsense there. So I would keep away from physics. Physics is not an easy area. It's an area that's rather like magic. So in order to keep your hands on reality, I would go as far as you can go with physical chemistry. So at least there you've got real things. You've got molecules. If you mix this red stuff with that blue solution, you get a green precipitate, and that always happens, And there's no argument about it. And with physical chemistry, you can extend chemistry into physics, right? And you can extend physical chemistry upwards into biology, into molecular biology. So if you want to study so that you have a kind of basic grip, or a basic a basic machine, a basic system of analysis that will enable you to look at anything, then you want to go to chemistry, I think. It may not be what you want to hear, but this is what I have found, that physicists really are are in hyperspace. You know, they're not people that really can deal with the real reality. They always ignore chemistry because they think it's lower class. And as for biology, you know, forget it. That, you know, these are just like wet things that they don't have to think about because they're all too kind of, they're not in no straight lines. You know, you open up a rat and all these sloppy things fall out, and you think, oh God, I don't want to know about that. You know, quick, get out the triple integrals. You know, so I keep away from physics if I were you. That's my advice. You know, young boys like you, I know in my experience, always want to do physics because they think it's romantic. But I can tell you it's a fucking nightmare. You know, you don't want to get there, really. It will destroy you. Yeah, so that's my advice. Go for chemistry.
Okay. And do you have something more to add? Maybe advise something to future scientists, to me and my peers interested in science?
Yeah, I did make a note about this. Well, basically it's this: always question everything. And always try to go back to the source. Like I said to you before about the black boxes, if you get a modern textbook on anything, you know, it will give you an idea of what's going on. But then if you go back to an earlier one, because what textbook writers do is they always copy it from the previous textbook, okay, and put in some pictures. And so the previous textbook then copies it from the previous textbook, and so on. You go right the way back. So always go back to sources for data. So if you're interested in an area and you want to see what's going on, go right back to the first scientific papers that were written on it and go forward from there. Always question. Don't ever believe what it is anybody says. Okay? Always think why, how, what, you know, who are they? Is there money in it for them? And all these questions you need to ask because they're good questions. I mean, I've been recently going back and looking at the earliest work on radiation and health. And if you go back to the source data, you find there's all sorts of problems with it. But what happened was they were just covered over, or they weren't understood at the time, or actually there might even be some bad guys, you know, who changed the data. In fact, we found that. So if you need to know what's going on, you always have to go back to the source. And there's one other thing I wanted to say, you know, if there's time. And that is, somebody should look at phenomena that physics doesn't normally deal with, or science, if you like, doesn't normally deal with. You know, what I like to think of myself as a student in the area of natural philosophy. This point about science, it makes me think about men in white coats and professors and so forth. I'd rather be a student myself, and I think there are a couple of areas. First of all, there's the area of what might be called parapsychology. There's a bloke called Sheldrake who is a scientist. He's a biologist at Cambridge, and you'll probably see him on the internet. He's a bit of a weird guy. I mean, I've met him, and he's got some very strange ideas. But what he does do is he takes the time to consider the empirical observation. So, you know, you must look at the world and you must accept what you see. You can't deny what you see on the basis of some theory. That's the main problem that there is with science at the moment. If you see something, you know, or if scientists see something, they say, oh, that can't be true because of so-and-so. But actually what Sheldrake did, one very interesting experiment, was he video cameraed dogs who belonged to an owner. And he had another video camera looking at the owner who was at work, long way away, you know, maybe 50, 70 miles away. And as soon as the owner gets up to come home, the dog sits up and starts wagging its tail and runs to the door. Now, there are clocks on the video cameras, okay? So the clocks show that the minute that this guy decides to come home, the dog registers it. Now, this can't be explained by physics at all. And so physicists say, oh, it's impossible. But this is an empirical fact. So if you're really a scientist, if you're a natural philosopher, you have to put that sort of fact, and there are lots of facts like that, you have to put that in some little box and think about it, because it's part of the physical world. It's part of the observational system of data that we have. And you just cannot say it can't be true because I don't think it can be true because I can't explain it. You have to think about that. And another thing you might think about is that quantum theory is based on the quantum equation, which is E equals h nu, where nu is the frequency of the process, right? And everybody has, right from Planck onwards, has said energy is quantized. So we're all taught in the textbooks that energy is quantized. It can only come in certain packets. You can have this energy or that energy, that energy. And this derives from spectroscopy. So when you look, for instance, at spectral lines, vibration, any spectral lines, but let's say visible spectral lines, you see these lines, like the Fraunhofer lines in the solar spectrum. So you don't get continuous emission of energy. You get spectral lines, so the energy levels in the atom are quantized, and so you can only have this energy, or you can have that energy, or you can have this energy, or whatever, right? But you can turn this equation on its head, and you can say that it's not energy that's quantized, it's time, right? Because E equals h nu is an equation involving energy and frequency and a constant. Now, frequency is 1 over time. So let's turn it on its head and consider what that means. If time is quantized, it means that nothing can happen between this time and the next time. It means that there's a sort of unit quantum of time. And energy can be continuous now in this new theory, or this new way of looking at it. So you have continuous energy but quantized time. But we know of one other area where you've got continuous energy and quantized time, and that's a computer. A computer has quantized time. It's the clock speed of the device. So in other words, nothing can happen between one clock cycle and the next clock cycle. So you just imagine some scientists, like some Planck scientists, who are now doing spectroscopy in the Sims. Sims is a sort of computer simulation with people that my daughter used to like playing with. Maybe you know about it. What they would discover is that energy was quantized, because they wouldn't know that the clock speed existed. So I'll leave you with that little thought.
Okay, thank you, Professor Busby, for this very interesting interview. It was my true pleasure to hear your wise words and friendly advices.
Okay, I'm good to have met you, and good luck with your researches.
Oh, thank you.